The Tomorrowverse had finally ended with its latest and final entry, Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 3. I think it's now the perfect time to talk about the entire continuity, one last time. It's also been a year since I uploaded my Tomorrowverse ranking, so this video will be my updated ranking for all 10 movies, from worst to best. Before we continue, what's the Tomorrowverse? The Tomorrowverse is the continuation or second phase of the DC AMU. It started with Superman Man of Tomorrow released in 2020, and gained its nickname with the release of that film. The entire shared universe that started from 2013 with Justice League The Flashpoint Paradox was ended this year with the release of Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Trilogy. And yes, the DC AMU and the Tomorrowverse is basically one long connected saga slash timeline slash continuity slash universe, whatever you want to call it. Honestly, this entire shared universe was impressively one of the most cohesive we've ever gotten at DC. Way more cohesive than the DCEU. While the quality of the Tomorrowverse movies only ranged from meh to slightly magnificent, and the continuity certainly made some choices, at least it managed to tell one coherent and very connected story with just 10 movies, or a total of 26 if we include the previous timeline. Anyways, here's my ranking for all of the Tomorrowverse movies. I'll be separating the 2 and 3-parters and count the movies as their own entry. I'm also not going to rank these movies based on quality alone, but also with its rewatchability and my overall personal preferences. If you want to share your own ranking and thoughts, feel free to comment it down below. Let's begin the ranking with the worst movie in my opinion, at number 10, Legion of Superheroes. Now, I don't hate this movie or have any strong negative feelings about it. I'm sure some of you might even like this one. But it's just the most boring out of the 10 movies of this list. Again, in my opinion. The story and twists and turns that it took were predictable and forgettable at worst, which is why I only have very short thoughts about this movie since I barely remembered anything from it. The Legionnaires, besides the leads, were just sort of there, and I never felt invested with the team. There were also these awkward pauses in between the dialogues that a lot of Tomorrowverse movies suffered from. There's still things to like here though. The opening scene with Kara and her mother before the death of Krypton was pretty neat. Kara had a solid development throughout the movie, and her relationship with Brainiac 5 was cheesy, but it worked well enough, it's fine. The post-credit scene was also cute until that happened. But overall, this movie never clicked with me, and to be honest, the Crisis Trilogy were a far better Supergirl story than this movie. I know that's shocking, but don't worry, we'll talk about those movies in a couple of minutes. In number 9, Green Lantern Beware My Power, the most disappointing movie out of the 10 movies on this list. It's one spot higher than Legions because of the simple fact that it's a Green Lantern story with Jon Stewart. And I would rather rewatch this movie than Legions, but I barely did that. Even though this is only in 9th place on my list, I don't hate it. Like I said, I was more disappointed and frustrated watching it. There's the noticeable dialogue pauses that most of the Tomorrow movies had. The movie constantly throws information and exposition at the viewer, which dragged out some of the parts of the movie, and made the world very underdeveloped, which was a really shame because I do like the lore surrounding the Lantern Corps. But the thing that I didn't like the most was how they handled Hal Jordan. I'm fine with the Emerald Twilight storyline, but doing it simultaneously with a Jon Stewart origin-esque story was a big mistake. Like, why? These two should have just teamed up instead of fighting each other. Hal Jordan didn't just suck in this movie, but also in Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 1 with his useless and disappointing cameo. There's gotta be someone at Warner Brothers that holds a grudge with Hal Jordan. They did him dirty in this continuity. The fact that Hal Jordan doesn't have that much appearances in DC animated projects nowadays disappointed me way more. They're using Jessica Cruz more than Hal, which is confusing and kind of insane that they're sidelining him. I don't dislike Jessica Cruz though, it's just questionable. I hope he appears more in future projects. They'll probably give him a push with the upcoming release of Lanterns. I hope that'll happen because Hal deserves more love and recognition. On the positive side, I do think that the action sequences here were nice, as well as the overall dark tone and atmosphere that this movie was going for. The voice casts were also solid. Overall, this movie could have been better if they didn't treat Hal Jordan like disposable garbage. In number 8, Justice League Warworld. A lot of people hate this movie. While I do understand the many glaring issues of this film, I still found some little entertainment here. However, the disappointment was still pretty high on this one. First of all, they should have just called this movie Trinity Warworld instead of Justice League because it never felt like the latter at all. The other flaws that I can think of this movie was the villain, Mongol, was pretty lame and his design sucks to be honest. And the concept was very interesting, but they executed it in the most average way possible. You can feel that the creators couldn't execute this big of a story due to the noticeable limited budget. Secondly, if I have to rank the 3 stories here, I would rank the Batman on a Primordial World segment in last place. It felt the slowest out of the three. There's tons of awkward pauses between the dialogues during the segment, and overall, the story was uninteresting. In second place would be Wonder Woman on the Wild West, the first segment. Nice action and appearance from Jonah Hex, didn't care for the romance, but it was an enjoyable enough start for the movie. In first place though would be the final story involving the Trinity on a 1950s sci-fi mystery. The story was interesting, the vibe was eerie, and I liked the black and white aesthetic. Lastly, the ending kind of ruined my experience. It was super jarring and anticlimactic. To be honest, Beware My Power and this movie's interchangeable, but as of this moment, I prefer this more because I wasn't totally pissed off by it. In number 7, Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 2. This is another movie that a lot of people dislike. The general consensus of it was that it was too boring and confusing, and the Bat family was barely in it even though they were featured prominently on the marketing of this film. I think it was alright. I wasn't excited about it even though I liked Part 1, and it wasn't until Part 3 was released that I watched this. Like I said, the movie's fine. There wasn't a ton of action sequences in it, but I'm totally fine with a superhero flick that doesn't have that much action if the story is good. The story here was interesting enough though, and was a nice subversion over the source material. The movie focused more on Psycho Pirate, Supergirl, and the Monitor. Three characters that were important but didn't have that much screen time in the original story. I think the creators did a great job of developing these three characters, while also converging them and their development in the final act. I liked how the Monitor changed on the course of the movie because of Kara. His development made him more three-dimensional than in Part 1 and even in the comics. I don't know who's the voice actor for the Monitor, but his vocal performance was one of my favorite things of this movie. Combining Kara and Harbinger as one character was also one of the great decisions that this flawed trilogy made, another deviation from the source material that works in my opinion. Since Kara had a connection with the Monitor, that made his death all the more heartbreaking. While her role wasn't totally perfect, I still think that they handled her character and development pretty well. Psycho Pirate's story was also disturbing and interesting. His dialogues and monologues were nicely written. He also provided some of the lighter and darker moments from this movie, and I liked how he connected to Justice Society World War II. This movie, and the trilogy as a whole, also filled in the gaps between the events of the previous entries, which was probably why some people found it confusing, but in my opinion it made the continuity more coherent than before. When it comes to the negatives, I think the budgets totally felt with this one. Some of the shadow demons were just standing around during the fight scenes, the towers doesn't have that much superheroes that guards them, and the Anti-Monitor lacks movement. Speaking of the Anti-Monitor, he totally sucks as a villain. He wasn't intimidating at all even though he's a multiversal threat. He just looks generic with his design, and the ending was pretty anticlimactic. But still, I don't hate this movie that much. As a matter of fact, I liked what it was going for with the characters and the story. But from what you can tell with its placement here on my list, it's the worst movie of the Crisis trilogy. In number 6, Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 3. In my opinion, this is a good enough conclusion to the entire Tomorrowverse and DC AMU timeline. The biggest thing that I liked about this movie was how it seamlessly connected itself to the DC AMU, and how they explored the aftermath and consequences of the timeline reboot. And major props to the creators involved on ending the continuities in a satisfying enough manner, even with a noticeable limited budget for these films. There were nice usages of certain characters here. For example, Batman, who didn't contribute much in the original story, but was given a much bigger role in this adaptation, and his scenes along with Constantine during their exploration and investigation of the previous and current timeline events were some of the highlights. Another character that I liked was Supergirl. Her role in this movie was pretty good, and like I said earlier, I liked that they combined both Kara and Harbinger as one character. Her sacrifice was also one major upgrade from the comics, and the way they adapted the iconic cover from the comics was fantastic, and Superman's scream over Kara's death was chilling. This film also serves as the final performance of the great Kevin Conroy as Batman, and I absolutely loved his appearance here, and his line was perfectly badass. Now, this movie still has the same issues that the previous movie suffered from. Some clunky sound design at times, poor pacing in certain parts, the Anti-Monitor being an abysmal villain, and the trilogy never living up to its full potential. But I think the story and characters worked well enough, and they ended this trilogy and the continuities decently. In number 5, Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 1. The best of the Crisis trilogy in my opinion. Like I said with my review that I uploaded a couple of months ago, this movie, while not perfect, still exceeded my expectations because of how it handled certain characters, especially the main star of this chapter, the Flash. Focusing this movie on the Flash while developing him, his relationship with Iris and the Justice League before his sacrifice was a decision that I liked. His and Iris' sacrifices were handled pretty good, and you totally felt the emotion due to the great vocal performance by the actors. Or at least, I felt the emotion while watching that scene. Amazo was featured in this movie, and I liked the redemption arc that he had as well. I've also seen a lot of people comparing this version to the DCAU Amazo, with how similar their arcs and identity crises were. I haven't fully seen that version though, except for a particular JLU episode, but that sounds nice. The non-linear story structure holds up really well, especially on rewatch. I know some might digress, but I do like me some non-linear storytelling if handled properly, and I think this movie did as good of a job on executing that. I would be repeating myself if I still say the flaws of this movie because this trilogy basically has the same issues from what I saw. But overall, this movie was the best in my opinion. It had the best usage of characters, some nice execution of ideas, and even if it's noticeably flawed, I surprisingly still found some enjoyability out of it. In number 4, Justice Society World War II. The Flash was also in this movie, and I like how this wasn't another Flashpoint story where Barry messes up the timeline and created an alternate version of it, because I certainly felt that during my first viewing. But as revealed in Crisis on Infinite Earths, this was Earth 2 during its version of World War II. This movie held up pretty well, especially with how the Crisis trilogy gave certain answers to unanswered questions. For example, who brainwashed Aquaman, and the fate of this Earth's version of Dr. Fate. So I appreciated this movie even more after watching this universe as a whole. The movie suffered a bit from poor pacing and the sound design at times. The action sequences here, while not mind-blowing, were nicely done. The third act was kind of slow, but the action was still pretty good though. So it's another Tomorrowverse movie that managed to execute its ideas in a pretty good way, and even if it dragged in some areas, I was still entertained by it overall. In number 3, Superman Men of Tomorrow. This was one of the better retelling/reimaginings of Superman's earlier years, and even if it's done multiple times, both in the comics and other medias, I still do like these kinds of Superman stories where he's still trying to find his place and purpose in the world. For this movie, the creators did a good job on putting an interesting spin on that concept. This version of Clark Kent was almost a combination of all the good characteristics of Christopher Reeve's and Henry Cavill's versions of the character, and his development from start to finish was handled with care and nuances. Parasite was also handled really well in the writing department. I'm not totally familiar with the villain, but I really liked this version, especially his backstory and tragic transformation. Lobo was here too and gave the comedy of the movie, but it never felt forced or went overboard, which I appreciated. Lois Lane, Martian Manhunter, and the other characters were here, but they didn't steal the movie in any memorable way, but they served the story well enough. The action scenes were not as stiff when compared to other entries of this franchise, and some looked really good. There wasn't as much of the dialogue pauses that plagued almost all of the movies in the Tomorrowverse. The sound design was good for the most part. Just like any other Tomorrowverse movies, this wasn't mind-blowing. It's familiar and predictable, but it's still an effective origin story for this version of Clark Kent, and a great start for the Tomorrowverse timeline. Sadly, the other movies weren't as good as this one, and the final two that we will be talking about right now. In number 2 and number 1, Batman The Long Halloween Parts 1 and 2. Now I said earlier in the intro that I'll separate the 2-parters and 3-parters here in my ranking, but these two final movies were pretty much interchangeable, and just like any other day, I prefer Part 1 over Part 2. Part 1 focused more on the detective side of the story. Most of the time it was slow and quiet, which I absolutely loved. It added a lot to the atmosphere and the tone of the duology as a whole. But the thing that I liked most about Part 1 was the investigation, and again, the detective side of the story. Batman, Harvey Dent, and Commissioner Gordon were balanced well enough in the story. All three characters shined, and their chemistry, their agreements and disagreements, were interesting and fun to watch. The mystery itself was fun to unravel, and when I saw this movie I haven't read the original comic book, so I never expected the direction that these movies took, and they actually surprised me. Obviously, now that I've read the original, I can confidently say that it's the better version of this story. Anyways, Part 2 is when the setups paid off. More and more of Batman's rogues start to appear, adding more conflict and action to the movie. Obviously, the best part of this part was Harvey and his descent into madness. The characterization for Two-Face was well done, and they basically copied the go-to template for a Two-Face origin story, which is why I liked it. Now, this duology obviously cannot, and did not, and will not top the original story because it's the original. Just for the art style alone, this movie's already beaten up. I still liked how they translated the characters into the Tomorrowverse art style, but no one can top the over-the-top, loose, and detailed caricatureness of Tim Sale's original artwork. A few deviation from the source material does change the way I, and probably some fans, interpret the mystery of this adaptation. I found it distracting at first, but I kind of understand why the writer changed it. If you have the time to watch these two movies, I suggest to see it for yourself. The grounded and gritty nature of these films sets it apart from the Tomorrowverse, where most of the movies tackled monsters, aliens, science fiction, and fantasy in a way. The Long Halloween just stood there in the middle. It's the black sheep of this continuity, and I meant that as a compliment, by the way. So yeah, I absolutely liked both of these movies. Some might argue that this duology were only good because the creators had arguably the best Batman material to work with. Of course, I partially agree on that, but that doesn't work all the time. Doesn't mean that creators or filmmakers have a great reference to work with that they'll immediately make a good movie out of it. Take a look at Batman Hush, a decent Batman story that was adapted abysmally in the DC AMU. So, thankfully, the creators involved with these two movies understood the material that they worked with and put out one of the best, or two of the best, Batman straight-to-DVD animated movies since Batman Ninja. That's why I appreciated this duology a lot. Anyways, that's all I got for you for this video. Again, feel free to share your thoughts on the comments below, and I'll see you on my next video that will probably release next month. Bye!